Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to You Alive. My name is Cui Fen. I'm a student from the Faculty of Arts and Social Science. Today's program will be split up into 3 portions. The first is a 10-minute talk by our speaker, Mr. Ravi Menon, followed by a 20-minute interview with Mr. Viswa Sadasivan, the chairman of our You Alive organizing committee. Finally, we will be having a 30-minute Q&A session. So if you wish to ask a question, do kindly proceed to the microphones located along the sides. Introduce yourself and speak it to them directly. Now, without further ado, please sit back and enjoy. Thank you very much.
You Alive.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ravi Menon.
Very good evening to all of you, and I'll start by saying I'm happy to be here, which is a rather odd thing to say because when Viswa first asked me to do this, I was certainly not happy. I was rather reluctant. But now that I'm here and standing in front of you, I actually do feel happy. And I think that's one of the things very often cited in those who study happiness. Human beings are amazingly adaptable. They may not like to do something, but when you're put in that situation, they adapt and make themselves happy. So I do mean it when I say I'm happy to be here, to have this opportunity to interact with you. And, with my background, I thought one thing I shouldn't talk about is economics, finance, public policy, and that stuff. I thought I'll speak about something that I don't know very much about, and I'm quite intrigued. And I thought that would be more interesting. So I chose the topic of happiness. Talk about, and why are we unhappy about it? I'll cover 4 things. First, how is happiness measured? What are its correlates? Second, is happiness absolute or relative? Third, is does public policy have a role in advancing happiness? And fourth, on a little bit of personal note, what are things that make me happy? What is happiness? I'll not try to define it because I don't want this to be an academic section. I think we all know it when we see it. Most of us intuitively understand what it is, and we recognize it when we feel it within ourselves. Those who study it for a profession call it by various names and make fine distinctions: life satisfaction, subjective well-being. I'll not get into those. I'll just use very loosely the term happiness to cover all of that. So I would beg the indulgence of academics to forgive my liberty with the word and imprecision. How is it measured? Well, unlike income or health, which can be measured in a little bit more objective fashion, happiness is measured really by asking people questions. It's really survey-based. Are you happy? On a scale of 1 to 5, scale of 1 to 10. That's how it's mostly done. And there is a school that says that if you ask too much about happiness, you become less happy. In fact, it was John Stuart Mill who actually said that. If you ask yourself if you're happy, you cease to become so. But setting that aside, people do lots of studies on these things and ask questions about their people's, about respondents' state of well-being. And they put these together to correlate with other things and see what are the factors that drive happiness. And across a range of studies, you've found that higher incomes lead to more happiness. No surprise about that. Being healthy is correlated with higher happiness. Being married is correlated with higher happiness. Being religious has been found to be correlated with higher happiness. Now, of all these factors, the one that has fascinated most people is the relationship between income and happiness, money and happiness. And lots of work has been done about this. The central question being, does income generate happiness? And I think we can look at it in three perspectives. One, within a country, quite certainly yes. Rich people generally report higher levels of happiness than poorer people. Now, if you look across countries, it becomes a bit more tricky. Generally, richer countries, by richer I mean per capita income, countries have higher levels of measured or recorded or surveyed happiness than poorer countries. But there are many striking anomalies, so that's why I said it's a little bit more tricky. Nigeria is supposed to have a higher level of happiness than Germany. Colombia is supposed to have a higher level of happiness than Canada. Indonesia supposed to have a higher level of happiness than Singapore. So the correlation between income and happiness is not a very strong one when you look across countries. Now, the third way of looking at it is across time, over time. Here the answer is a bit more decisively no. The relationship is very weak. People have studied the United States for many years. Over time, as incomes in the United States have risen, happiness levels have not. And so many theories have been put forward as to why that is the case. There is a notion of satiation, that beyond a certain point of income, additional increments to income do not create more happiness or sense of self-being. Other factors come into play. And I think that's an interesting insight to reflect on. This leads us to the second question. If that is the case, then is happiness relative or absolute? There is quite a lot of thinking, if you look around us, that happiness is in many ways relative. People have found that when my income goes up, I become more happy. But if everyone else's income also goes up together, I don't become more happy. So happiness is largely defined in terms of relative wealth and relative income. And it's not only income. The notion of a relative basis for deriving satisfaction applies to other things as well. The other correlates. I said earlier on, no, I didn't mention that, unemployment. If you're unemployed, your happiness level drops. But if the unemployment rate in the community you live in is very high, you actually don't feel much less happy. Even marriage, conventional wisdom, and it's been demonstrated time and again, married people are happier than singles. But when they looked at communities where predominantly they are singles, they were not less happy than married people. So social benchmarks seem to matter a lot. The expectations that society has of what is desirable seems to affect our happiness levels. And if we are divorced from that, happiness doesn't seem to be affected. Now, there is a view, of course, that happiness is not relative but absolute. This is a perspective from philosophy or religion, that happiness is inherently subjective and intrinsic and comes from within. Self-knowledge, relationship with God, and these things are not relative, but in an absolute sense. But there are also interesting contemporary studies looking at psychology. A person wins a lottery. They measured his happiness, sense of well-being. It sharply rises. But within 6 months after that, when they survey the same person, his happiness falls down to the same old level. Interestingly, they also did this with people, say, who have met with an unfortunate accident, for instance. People who maybe have lost a limb. Some of them go into depression. Obviously, happiness takes a sharp dip. But 6 months later, a year later, they find that happiness levels bounce back up again. And we see this around us. Bereavement takes a toll on happiness, but time seems to heal. It's as if we have an IQ and an EQ. It's as if we also have a HQ, happiness quotient, that each of us has. And it's something that we cycle around, but we keep coming back to it as if it's some kind of equilibrium that each of us has. So in that sense, it seems to be quite quite an absolute thing. The question that is of most interest these days is the role of public policy. Does public policy have a role in influencing happiness? I'll put three perspectives before you, and we can have a discussion about this later. The first perspective is try to compute a measure of happiness that is as comprehensive as you can, based on all the correlations that I've just highlighted. Create a comprehensive index and try to maximize it. Now, this index, of course, would cover a whole range of things. This has been done. You'll be familiar with Bhutan's Gross National Happiness Index. The OECD has come up with a life quality index. And you'll be amazed. The GNH of Bhutan has 33 different indicators. Covers a whole range of things. The things that governments can influence: economic security, physical and mental health, cleanliness of the environment. But it also has other things: work-life balance, cultural participation, family relationships, value systems, spirituality, things that people regard as contributing to happiness, but beyond the pale of government action or public policy. So that's the difficulty with that. It's comprehensive. You know what you're trying to measure, and you can weight it according to people's preference, but not all the things there are subject to public policy. The second perspective is, well, ignore all the other stuff, focus on the environment that supports people's pursuit of happiness, which is an individual goal, an individual enterprise, but focus on the environment. And this would include the things like, the most important things are availability and opportunity. Healthcare, education, housing, not just available, but affordable and accessible. And if you can measure those things, then you can make an assessment of the environment in which people can be happy. But whether they're happy or not still depends on a whole round of other things. But at least these are things that governments can seek to influence. The last perspective is to choose one indicator that best approximates or correlates with all the other factors. And this is why people look at GDP. Now, GDP has been much maligned, and I'm not going to defend it, but it has something going for it, because richer countries tend to have better healthcare, better quality of education, better sanitation, cleaner environment, generally lower crime. So the correlations of all the other factors with GDP is very high. And so there is some wisdom, some meaning in why people have tended to look at GDP. But the big problem with looking at GDP as an indicator of well-being is that it ignores, I think, the critical element of opportunity. It does not look at the distribution of resources and whether everyone has an opportunity, equal or otherwise, to avail of the riches of society. That, I think, is a central failing of GDP. And I think, if you asked me, I think it has served us well in Singapore as an indicator, because if you had focused on a range of things, we would have been misled, as many other countries tragically found out. We've been able to maximize welfare for the largest number of people by that focus on GDP. But I think we've reached a point where that's no longer sufficient, that these broader environmental factors that support self-being, sense of well-being, matter increasingly more. And we need to really think hard about how we can create more composite indices of quality of life or standard of living that go beyond GDP. Let me close with what are the things that make me happy. I'll cite 4 sources: friends, family, country, and God. I'll very quickly hasten to add that having a basic material needs met quite comfortably is an important factor, because without that, it'll be much harder to derive happiness from these other things. So I don't want to minimize the importance of income and access to opportunities. That is a very basic thing. But beyond that, these are the things that, and I can attest to what I've said earlier on about beyond a certain point, additional increments, be it in income or wealth or associated material rewards, do not give you that incremental happiness as much as the quality of relationships that you build around. And that I found to be exceptionally satisfying. I just want to touch a little bit on country, because I think satisfaction and happiness derived from networks of friends, family, and for those who believe in God, I think are well known. When I mean country, I refer to my work. And I use the word work in the positive sense, unlike, unfortunately today there's a tendency to use this unfortunate phrase, work-life balance, suggesting there's something terrible about work that is anti-life. I think one can derive much happiness and satisfaction from work if you believe in what you're doing and if you're driven by a sense of purpose in that work. And as a public servant, that has been especially gratifying to do work that you believe in, that you believe makes a contribution. And I say it with a certain amount of humility because you realize how little you can actually influence, and yet the little that you do makes somebody better off. One doesn't need to be in public service to serve country or to society. I think the important point is that if we are able to serve a larger good, that is probably one of the most durable sources of happiness. I want to close by recounting something that I learned a long time ago. I was a Boy Scout, a Cub Scout, a Boy Scout, and a Rover Scout in secondary, pre-U, and in secondary, primary, secondary, and pre-U. I learned a lot as a scout during those formative years from my friends and from the experiences that I went through. And one of the things that I learned most was what the founder of the Scout movement, Lord Baden-Powell, said. And I thought it was quite appropriate for today's topic. And I want to read that to you. So I actually used to memorize it before, but it's been a long time since I was a scout, so I kind of decided I shouldn't fumble with it. Now, he wrote this as his last message to the scouts of the world. The real way to get happiness is by giving happiness to other people. Try and leave this world a little better than you found it. And when your turn comes to die, you can die happy in feeling that at any rate, you have not wasted your time, but have done your best. Thank you very much for your attention. Look forward to discussion. Hi, Vishwa.
One day, all civil servants, I hope, will be like you. Well, along the lines of what you said at the end, it's very thought-provoking, especially since I was a scout as well in the same school, right? I remember when I went on my honeymoon, feels like 200 years ago, to a place called Kashmir. And my wife and I, my bride actually, and I, we were traveling this car. It was very, very cold. And it was pouring. And we saw this bunch of 5-year-olds playing makeshift cricket. They were all naked, right? And my wife commented, she said, these poor kids, look at how miserable they must be in this cold, naked. I said, look at them. They must be saying that about us, being trapped in a car. Because they looked so much happier than we were.
And this was your honeymoon?
This was my honeymoon. And we believed that we were at the peak of happiness then, you know. And we were actually.
Okay.
But
so it's been downhill since?
It's been downhill since. Don't get me started, okay? Now, the point is everything is relative. Everything is contextual. So I would put to you that it is not how much you earn per se, or how much you don't earn. It is really a feeling of being denied what others in your context seems to have in abundance. Isn't it? If everybody around you is clothless, I think you would probably find even if you feel cold, you can live with it. But the moment some people start having the privilege of getting clothes and you don't, you start feeling more and more unhappy. Yes? So it is relative, it is contextual, and therefore it is not at all surprising that the poll, the Gallup poll, highlighted not only Indonesia, Indonesians being happier than Singaporeans, but Iraq, Afghanistan as well. Yeah. And we were right at the bottom of the scale. Of course, one can argue, as senior civil servants tend to, that these surveys are subjective. But that aside, there is some sense to the outcome. So I'd like your comment on this. Let's talk specifically about meritocracy and equal opportunities. When we were growing up in the 1960s, 70s, the two meant the same thing, actually, because the median income was low. But as we became more affluent, the median income started going up. The gap between meritocracy and equal opportunities actually widened. So that has resulted in, I would say, that has resulted in a lot of the unhappiness, because people generally feel that if you are of a certain income bracket, your chances of ever catching up are gone. And that sense of helplessness, because the context has changed, because you're now able to see right in front of you people streaking ahead of you, and there's no way you can catch up, no matter how talented you might be, because the odds are so heavily stacked against you. That really affects your capacity to find happiness in life, and for a long time. Would you comment on that, please?
Yeah. And I think you chose the word well. It's the conflict between meritocracy and opportunity. And it used to mean the same thing, but it's increasingly different. And when I spoke earlier on about the second perspective, focus on not just availability but also opportunity, that's what I was alluding to.
The GDP, you talked about GDP and the distribution.
Yes, the distribution, The traditional notion is that if you have a pure meritocratic system, then those who are better endowed, whatever the society values as being important, rise to the top. And the way opportunity is equalized is that you try to make sure that everyone starts off on the same footing. But when meritocracy builds up, it's like the race is not starting at one point, it's a relay. Because after the first batch of runners have run, and they pass the baton to the second batch of runners, you don't start at the same point. And the lead grows as the relay continues, and really it's intergenerational. And I think that is one of the critical challenges all, especially advanced high-income countries face. How do you reconcile opportunity and meritocracy? The more dismal view, of course, is that meritocracy, a little like what Marx said about capitalism, sows the seeds of his own destruction. That when you carry this far enough, actually ceases to be meritocratic, because the inequality in opportunity is so sharp that it is actually not true merit that is being rewarded. But it's not easy to address it. People often speak about education as a great leveler in terms of equalizing opportunities. But in practice, it's questionable whether it happens that way. In the West, they have experimented with early childhood education to intervene at points where the disadvantages do not become entrenched. But as the Economist once put it, the most powerful force in the world is parents' love for their children and their obsession with giving them a head start. So if you start taking kids at kindergarten, the richer parents start the race at nursery. If you go to nursery, they'll take it to the womb.
They have already,
yes. So not all
Have
children
you?
have listened to Mozart music, for instance, right?
How old were your kids in the womb when you started?
When it's I did it for the first. We gave up for the second because it made no difference.
I think
a lot
that's
of it is
genetic.
humbug too. But it is a real issue. It's a real problem. Now, the transmission of advantage across generations, I think that's what nags people's sense of fair play most. I know it's probably not the correct thing to say. Inequality per se, I don't think is a problem, because if it is a result of a society with, that treats everyone equally, then where you stack up, the way we, in university, for instance, or in schools, you study, everyone had an equal chance to study, and where you stack up is the outcome of that process, or the market. What people are aggrieved by is not that stacking up has come out differently in terms of outcomes, but it's perpetuated and accentuated over generations. And you then feel that you can't overcome the disadvantage.
So I would agree with you that this, no matter how much you intervene, like Heng Swee Keat has, as Education Minister, come up with several measures for early intervention. I'm sure they'll help, but I don't think, as you correctly said, I don't think they will correct effectively or sufficiently the anomaly because of the human instinct to want to have your kids do better than others, right? So the solution to it may not be here. This could be a palliative, but may not be the solution. The solution might be in finding ways to temper expectations, isn't it, at the end of the day? And really, it's about shifting the reflexes of society. And this is where perhaps we can learn a thing or two from the very societies that we have often condemned. I'm talking about the Scandinavian countries for their welfare policies. They've been our punching bag for a long time, but I think there's much we can learn from them, because I don't think it's coincidental that Denmark has consistently ranked very highly in terms of happiness, in terms of the Global Happiness Index. I don't think it's Kelong. I think it is. There's something to it, and I would put it to you, and like your views on this. It probably has to do with something a friend of mine who is Danish, who told me last year. He said this very simply. I asked him, how do you feel about exceptionally high taxes? Your income tax as well as your VAT. And he shrugged his shoulders and said, so we earn, and we see it as our duty, and we're happy to do it, to give it back, to put it back in the kitty, to be redistributed. And we don't need so much of money to be happy. These were his exact words. We don't need so much of money to be happy. You see, so I feel that society has actually come to terms with the reality that we do not need a Ferrari to inject happiness in us. We will therefore find it through some other sources, like some of those that you mentioned. So unless we shift the marker, so to speak, I think we will continue to be trapped in this. The question is, how does a society shift markers unless you allow for different points of leadership and focus in society to start coming up? It cannot just be a pyramid, simple pyramid governed by the government, but perhaps you need other areas, right? Religious leadership, sports leadership, and other areas to start surfacing so that we can all sit together and say, you can find happiness in any of these areas. But we need to temper the expectations in the first place. Question to you, how and is it possible for us to make that shift? And if so, how long will it take?
No, I agree with you that you do need to redefine the various sources in which people derive fulfillment. And like I said, even being married or single is not, it depends on what the context is. One challenge that Singapore has is that we are very small. In a much larger country, you can find your own, and I don't mean just geographic niche, but niche in many other sense of the word, given the large population base, the spread of the land, the diversity of activities that are usually possible in large countries, that you can have different expressions of talent and merit and be recognized for it and celebrated for it. But in a smaller country, it becomes a little bit more difficult. So that's a constraint. And who defines it? The government blames the people blame the government. But I think collectively, as a country, we have defined ourselves in rather narrow terms. So,
how do you think we can shift the markers?
As you said, we need more positive examples emerging. Second, I think as more of us broaden our horizons, we will dare to take plunges in different directions. Looking at the youth today, I think it's a little bit more encouraging. And I don't mean to say anything disparaging about the older generations. In fact, I think they were very sacrificial, very focused on, getting a decent wage, providing for the family, getting the kids educated. And we defined success in those terms, in terms of incomes and education, in the conventional sense of the word. And because for that time, that was necessary, and one does not, I think you can't take anything away from them. This is largely a migrant society making out a living here and building a country. And they've not seen the world. They've not seen, this is the context in which they operated. But today, I think, fortunately, one of the positive side effects of affluence is the exposure that we have, either through travel or through the internet, the web, that you are sensitized to broader range of areas in which you can seek excellence, and people pursue those dreams. So very often we see in our, even in our workplaces, people taking time off to do something different, people taking time off to excel in some other area, and not in just their work and providing for their family. And I think if you have more of these, that will be positive. The size is a constraint. I mean, we've all spoken about sports leadership, but will we pay the kind of money that sports enthusiasts pay in America to finance a Michael Jordan, for instance? See, the size does play a part in constraining.
But would you say, going back to what you said, Ravi, would you say that it would be useful to allow for people who have done well in areas that are not the traditional, conventional pathways, to be given a lot more of genuine highlight, right? And not patronized. See, sometimes when you highlight, it comes across as if you are patronizing them. But it doesn't seem genuine enough. When you highlight a sports achiever, it's either token, it appears tokenism, or it appears like you're patronizing. How can we move away from that? Do you think there could come a time when we could actually celebrate some of these things? And by the same token, as a society, start sending a signal that it is no more fashionable to flaunt. To flaunt. In fact, it is ugly to flaunt wealth. I don't know. I'm just throwing up some ideas.
Yeah. Yeah.
Would it be possible for us to shift? And if so, who takes the lead?
Well, shift we must. And what you're doing here at You at Live is a positive example with the diversity of people that you choose to bring on stage here and profile and celebrate and engage and talk to. I think that in itself, and you need more of these kinds of efforts across the island.
And to humanize senior civil servants.
Yeah, I'm more of the run-of-the-mill type of guy, so I'm probably a filler for the, and you can get a good speaker from, the...
Oh, they told you? Okay, sorry.
Yeah, so the other interesting is we, actually it's a trilemma. It's not just between meritocracy and opportunity. It's also about diversity. and valuing diversity for its own sake. Increasingly, you see both workplaces and company boards looking out for diversity as an end in itself, and people with different backgrounds who have excelled in different areas are being recognized increasingly. But I think this must stand the test of whether the diversity in itself adds value. And I think in many instances it does. But we can't take too blanket an approach on that. And I don't mean diversity in the traditional sense of gender and ethnicity, but in terms of variety of backgrounds, variety of things that you excelled in before. And when you bring that diversity together, do you get a more powerful outcome than if you had people with similar backgrounds, all excellent in that background, whether they perform better. And I think that'll be an interesting thing to see how it evolves. But I think more and more companies, corporations, are finding that value. They look out really for difference. In other words, if I have 9 people who are of a similar mold, the 10th person I want to be very different just for the sake of that difference, because I think that person will add more than another 10th person who's very similar but exceptional also in terms of achievement in that area. I think if we can see more of that, we can start broadening this idea of what it means to excel in different areas.
Do you see us taking baby steps at least in that direction? Or is it one step forward and 2 steps back?
No. I think baby steps, but babies do fall at times. So we do have to pick ourselves up and keep making those steps.
But sometimes when the babies fall, you find them badly produced products and you chuck them.
Yeah. So we just have to make sure the Pampers are well padded, take the fall. But seriously, I think that is very important.
No, I think you've hit on something that's very important, because to celebrate diversity, to celebrate the maverick in us, and I remember making a speech in our school in RI some time back and saying that we should actually celebrate mischief. It's very interesting. Let me share an anecdote. When my batch mates, we meet up, all those guys who are your typical star performers in school, your president scholars and all, they come in their small conservative cars, with their children, and they all look completely bored with life. And then after about half an hour, when the function is started, you hear this boom box and this beautiful BM convertible comes in, right? And this guy, even though he's 50, he jumps out of the car, to make a point almost. And this is a guy that every teacher said, you shouldn't even bother to waste your time and sit for the exams. And he is probably the richest and the happiest. Of course, he flaunts it, So I think sometimes we underestimate people's potential very early in life. Many of us have experienced this. Teachers telling you you're useless over and over again, right? And many of us actually believe it and end up being very unhappy. The stronger ones, the really belligerent ones, like Victor Savage, make it in life, although that's a moot point anyway. All right, with that, shall we throw it open to the floor and get some of your questions? This was a warm-up. Now it's a real discussion, okay? Looking at you guys, some of you look quite sad, actually. All right, so can we have the first question, comment, but please no speeches. Yes, sir.
My name is Tan Siping, graduate of the University of Malaya back in 1955.
He's here for every single
Really?
forum.
Oh, yeah.
Give him a big hand, ladies and gentlemen.
I just wish to contribute whatever I think that constitute happiness. But actually, it depends on each individual. Sometimes you go and eat the char kway teow, then you are very happy. But those people who are very rich, no less than going to a restaurant, 5-star restaurant, order the steak and so on. Therefore, it is individual one rather than the general holistic one you can think it. So if you are very happy sitting next to a girl, pretty one, provided your wife won't pull your ear, then you are quite happy, right? Provided no one tell on you and then you go to court and then you face all sort of slanders and so on. Therefore, each individual has got its own idea of happiness. Therefore, you cannot compare across the board and say, oh, all Singaporeans will like durian or whatever it is, or Singaporeans will like to travel. All that is quite a sweeping statement, right? Some people are just contented pottering in their backyard. They never want to leave the house at all. But some will like to visit. Some will go and walk around the block and shake hands with people and say, I'm so-and-so, and all that. So it depends on each individual. And you must cater for his idiosyncrasy. Some people are like that, and they are very quiet. They never talk to anybody. But he's quite happy. You don't go and disturb him. Disturb him, he will get angry and probably chase you out, right? Therefore, and then finally, your point about variety. So I was thinking, variety is the spice of life. You cannot be eating the char kway teow every day until you get sick. Therefore, you want to eat laksa or some other stuff. Therefore, variety is the one we have to treasure, rather than throughout your whole life you eat nothing but a bubu cha-cha or something like that. Thank you.
But don't forget, your wife is sitting there. Okay. So, you know the variety argument, huh? Okay.
Has its limits.
Yes. Please. Oh, Siping, now you're in trouble. Okay.
Just now we are talking about happiness. I think contentment is very important. Once you are contented with your life, happiness comes along. To me is, in life, if you live simply, do not compare and contrast with other people. Do not envy and get jealous of other people. Be what you are. Try to be contented that, well, as you mentioned about religion, well, if God give me this type of faith, be satisfied with it. And always feel that there's life, there's hope. Once you have that, you feel you're very contented and you're happy. But once you get jealous, oh, he's richer than I. As I say, some people are having this car and that car. You'll never be contented. You'll never be happy. And to me, is contentment depends on your own attitude, your own mind, how you think about it. Therefore, to me, is happiness is what you want to make it, not other people. You yourself. What do you think of happiness? How are you going to find happiness? You say, for example, as you said, the children were playing in the cold. Well, they're happy. They're very contented. And you, because you have been an experienced person, you think of other things. Therefore, you are not contented.
You're talking about me?
That's why I feel that contentment in life depends on your own attitude. So if you want to be happy, be what you are today. All of us are different. None of us the same. And God gives us what we want, what He wants us to do, and be contented. And there's always hope. When you think of hope, you're happy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I guess we all needed that reminder, right? So on that, if I could just pick up a question from there on the point of contentment. See, recently a friend of mine who has been doing business in Burma, in Myanmar, made this very interesting, I'm sure, cryptic comment. He said, well, that's the end of contentment in Myanmar. That's the end of contentment for the Myanmese. You know what I'm saying? The Iron Curtain is out. They now have a basis for comparison, which leads to dissatisfaction because of unmet expectations. Because everybody wants to follow the Joneses, it's human nature. And then you become a lot more unhappy. Because the irony is this: who says they were not happy when in the older state, in the earlier state? Because they didn't have a basis, that much of a basis for comparison. I don't know. It's a comment made by someone who's been in Myanmar for a long time, doing business there for more than 15 years. And this was his statement. What's your take on that statement?
Yeah. I thought that was a very, very important point about contentment. It's another way to view happiness.
Yeah.
And I'll offer two perspectives. One, which is very much along the lines of what you just said. If we define happiness as a fraction or a ratio, with the numerator being desires fulfilled and the denominator being the desires that you have, what we're all trying to do is to work on the numerator to fulfill more and more of our desires, without realizing that as you fulfill more of the numerator, the denominator is expanding even faster, because the desires you have grow even faster. And that the true way to happiness is contentment, which is try to reduce the denominator. Because as the denominator reduces, the ratio goes up. I think there's great wisdom in that, and I think there's great wisdom in that message about contentment. The specific question you raised, the contentment, now that's a bit more controversial. The contentment that comes from ignorance, because you did not know better, is that a basis for true and lasting happiness? I'm not too sure. If someone is happy but living in extremely harsh conditions, but did not know better, is that a durable form of happiness? Do we keep them in their ignorance and let them continue, but run the risk that eventually they will realize what is around them? Or do we seek to, and this used to be argued strenuously by those interested in the field of development.
Yes, development.
Do you
economics.
shake up primitive societies and give them something? Amartya Sen, for instance, made that argument that just because a poor person who's being exploited, persecuted, seems happy, do we leave him in that state? Or do we take him out? You run the risk that he will generate new desires and be discontented, but you have elevated him to a higher state of being. So that's why I think we cannot go to the extreme of saying that socioeconomic conditions do not matter, that satisfying material needs do not matter. They do. One needs to be tremendously blessed, I think, to find true happiness in poverty, and even when exposed to riches, remains contented. But I think you're talking about saints in those contexts. But I think in other contexts, you do need to help.
But the dilemma, as you said, J.S. Mill, of public and private liberties and public and private rights and freedoms, all these things come in. That's a dilemma for societies, right? Because in trying to build your GDP, you're trying to do something at a macro level. And assuming that it will trickle down and translate to happiness for the individual. But there seems to be a conflict. So from a public policy point of view, how do we find the middle ground? Or is it impossible to find the middle ground? Because is it just one way? The moment you take that path, it is this way. I mean, that's what it appears to be. The moment you take the path towards GDP growth, then it's almost as if we have to accept that we are not going to have a growth in happiness at an individual level, at a lower level of society. Is that
well? I think it needn't be that way. I would argue that given the kind of poverty-stricken status that we were in, it was necessary to generate that income growth that raised people's horizons and in that process expectations, and as a byproduct discontentment, which makes them strive harder. And it has, in a sense, uplifted, I think, the standard and quality of life. The challenge you pose is a real one, though. It is it's a matter then of changing course or adjusting your course as you go along.
Adjusting the pace.
And the pace and the definition of success, as we discussed earlier on, and in pursuing other things as well, and in managing expectations. But to say that because you will unleash this discontentment, therefore you should all remain in that
No,
deprived
that's what I'm
state.
saying. I'm
that
saying,
I
is
think
it possible to take that path and yet not allow the denominator to expand at the rate at which it's
Yeah.
been expanding? That's my question. Is it
Yeah.
possible or not? What do you all
I
think?
think you have no choice.
To give the speaker a bit of time to think, I'll throw it open to you. No, because it's a real question. Because at the end of the day, we've got to ask ourselves this basic question, right? Is it an either or? Right? If society moves towards higher GDP growth or GDP growth at a certain rate, does it really mean that in the end, those who in the lower levels of society economically, socioeconomically, will continue to grow in unhappiness? Is that what is that what the equation is? Or can it be an alternative? Yes, please.
Viswar, thank you for the question. So my simple answers to that.
Your name, please.
Oh, eyes, anyway.
Sorry?
I'm just a layperson.
Your name is layperson.
Yes.
Okay.
No, the question is that, the question that you pose on,
Okay.
I think that in simplicity, I think that here the question is, Ravi would agree, civil servant in Singapore, with the tendency to go for value instead of virtues. So when we miss the wood for the tree, then it's a problem. So my next supplementary to that, the question is that my learned friend have mentioned about contentment. But then you see Bush went to bed at 8 o'clock at night. No CEO, government CEO, ever got to sleep at 8 o'clock. So is that the point of contentment? So the other thing when you mentioned, Viswa, about the question of meritocracy, you've forgotten to include the possibility of meritocracy. That's what our tendency seems to be. We're going for efficiency at the expense of proficiency. How do you relate that kind of equality in terms of achieving when you find that there's no sense to it? So, and finally, when you say that about Denmark, and so is Netherlands, you see, the question of freedom of sex there, you can't expect Asian to expect that kind of rate of standardization in terms of valuation. And finally, Bhutan is overtaken by Tonga and Polynesian. So it's no longer the old, mechanism of the happiness that we're talking about. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. Yes.
Good evening. I'm Christopher. I'm a graduate student at NUS. I have a question about...
You want to step down? I feel uncomfortable for you. Yeah, that's better.
I have a question about diversity, particularly in the public service. I was in the public service for a brief period. And also back to the point about the GDP, do you think that perhaps the reason why we are so focused on the GDP is because there's a lack of diversity in the types of people who are in the public service? I mean, across the board, of course, various ministries and statutory boards, they would not have, there will be a varying levels, but for instance, there's quite a high concentration of, for instance, scholars in the higher rungs of the civil service. And having most of them having gone through the same system, you would lack that kind of diversity regardless of where they were trained in various universities around the world. So do you think there could be a problem because there's not enough diversity, let's say mid-career entrants or even people of various backgrounds being at the middle to higher levels of the civil service?
Okay, let me take both sets of issues together. First, I think we should try to avoid posing the question as a growth versus distribution issue. I think that is an artificial choice. There is this misnomer that because growth is rapid, distribution gets worse. Actually, what's happened is that in the old days, with growth came better distribution and equity. That has stopped. Now with growth, you don't have that improvement in distribution. But that is quite a different thing from saying it's because of growth that distribution has suffered. A very easy way to bring down the Gini coefficient is for Singapore to go into recession.
Yeah.
Because what will happen is that the lower income groups will get a small pay cut. Those at the higher income will have huge cuts in their bonuses, right? The Gini coefficient goes up, but are we really better off? So I think this tendency to blame growth for our distribution problems is a little bit of an artificial choice. But what we do need to recognize is that the old model doesn't work anymore. That just because you have growth, you're going to get better distribution. No, you now need to work harder. You need to think of the quality of that growth, the type of that growth, not so much to suppress it, but to find new expressions and new ways in which the fruits of growth are distributed. I think that should be the focus, and to avoid this very too easy comparison. Diversity in the public sector. Now, the diversity I was referring to is in terms of variety of backgrounds and an ability to take account of a wider range of attributes. Actually, that is happening. So I think that diversity is still not quite getting it right, because today, if you look at people who get the scholarships, people who get into the positions in very coveted organizations, be it public sector or even in the private sector, they are really all-rounded, not just academically, but in terms of sports, in terms of cultural achievements, in terms of also community service. Amazing resumes. So they do have that diversity. The diversity I was thinking of is that, are we missing people who are just below that? And that's a big problem. I've not met yet a HR manager or director who's able to deliberately choose a candidate who is second or third best compared to the first best. And on what basis do you choose that person? See? And we know from our own experience, it is not true that all president scholars do well, and it's not true that all non-scholars do not do well. There is sufficient churn in the system. We do study some of these numbers. The correlations break down. They're not that strong. Look, when we look back at our own generation, when we were in school, the way in which people stacked up today correspond to how they stacked up in school? No. There's tremendous churn. So in a sense, academic results are really overrated, but we continue to be irrational and drawing very strong correlations. So even without that, we are getting a lot of churn. But it is the guy who gets a B+, a B-, who doesn't make the grade, but who actually, in some circumstances, turns out to be a much better performer than the scholar or the A grader. Now, how do we get those kinds of people in? It's very challenging, very difficult. I mean, we know that there are some gems out there, but we don't have a basis for selection. See, the easiest screening mechanism and this is not only the public sector, I think it applies equally well to the private sector. The easiest screening mechanism is still your academic grades. You want to be broader, your sports achievements and other things, but it's still an achievement rotation. The second stringer, how do you unearth his attributes that's not reflected in these things? Huge challenge. But that's one thing we need to work harder at.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you. Jacob Phelps, PhD student here and also from Costa Rica. And the irony is not lost on me that I should have moved from one of the happiest countries in the world to here. And I think that that's the elephant in the room maybe, which is that despite the fact that these indices they're problematic, comparability across countries is difficult, and yet we live in a country that is self-reported not particularly happy. And I'm hoping that you can speak a little bit more directly to that point. You mentioned, yes, there's it's a very, very small country. We're in direct proximity to others who lead us to lack of contentment because we're always comparing ourselves. But is that an adequate explanation for the fact that of dozens of countries, Singapore doesn't rank that well? Maybe you can speak to that a little bit more, because I mean it's a concern, I think, in a very real way. It's not something abstract. It's something that we address, that we deal with in a very everyday and very real sense.
Thank you.
Well, I think the two things that pose particular challenges for us is, one, our rather narrow definitions of success or achievement, and two, our small size, which makes comparisons on that dimension very apparent in our eyes. I think these two conspire to create a sense of greater discontentment than in larger countries, which have more varied expressions of excellence. So I'm not. So what I'm saying is that there is an inherent disadvantage in a city-state that has a narrow definition of success and such great visibility of differences that it generates a certain amount of discontentment. And so the stuff that we discussed earlier on, that is that we have to work harder than most other countries to overcome this because we have these inherent disadvantages. So we have to work even harder along some of the lines we've spoken about. I don't think there is a silver bullet, and I'm not even hopeful that we are going to overcome this entirely. I mean, to be quite honest, it's not going to be that easy. But I think try we must, and we have done some things. We've got to just keep persisting in that direction. And as people's horizons broaden, and again, I come back to what I see of very young people who, take a year off to either go traveling, take a year off to do some community service, build a village, and pay a price actually sometimes in their career advancement, but come across happier. And that has a demonstration effect. More and more people will then start doing that. So I'm hopeful, but I would not exaggerate my optimism. I think, in a sense, we are going to be always a slightly discontented society. We just have to take that as part of our karma and move on.
Why do you feel that we are destined to be always a slightly discontented society? Why is it so difficult for us to be a little bit more optimistic? Given the fact, as you said, that more and more young people are taking gap years, they're going out, they're trying, and not, it's not token. I've met a lot of young people who go on expeditions organized by SIF and other organizations, and they enjoy it. King Soon is here. Yeah? King Soon has also had very positive, experiences with younger Singaporeans who don't remain that open after a few years of exposure to material comforts. But the point is, is it really true that we do not have reason to be more optimistic, that we are destined to be discontented as a society? I mean, back to your question. What is it? Is there something pathologically wrong with us that we are to remain this way, or can we expect? Is it a reasonable expectation that we can change as societies do? And if so, what is holding us back?
No, I don't think we are pathologically different. I just go back to the two special circumstances that we have, which is a small size, which makes these very in your face and constantly reminds you, even if you want to break away from it. And two, the narrower definitions of excellence. And I did say I'm hopeful, looking at the young, that is gradually changing. All I'm saying is that compared to other places, it's going to be more difficult here.
More difficult, okay.
So it's not as if we will remain discontented or destined to remain discontented. But we have a bigger challenge, and we must be realistic in understanding that we're going to take longer, and we may never achieve the kinds of contentment that you might see in simpler, more wide-ranging societies.
Okay.
Part of being a city-state is, it has a certain tempo and a certain rhythm that's going to be challenging. That's all.
Well, if I can shift gears a little bit, since we're coming to the end of the discussion. When we travel to other cities, like New York City, somehow you get a sense of variety. A lot more license for people to be themselves. A simple example. In Singapore, if you want to busk, you need a license, which for me goes completely against the whole concept of busking. So I think we are obsessed with organized activities. We are obsessed with programs, which do work. I'm not saying we should not have programs at all, but I think we are a little obsessed with it. Why not let certain things go? It may be inefficient, it may even be chaotic, but let it be. Let it be a little bit more, But I don't know. I feel that we, even within within the space constraints, it is possible for us to let up a little bit more, in fact, a lot more, without us losing a grip on things. But perhaps there's an obsession with power and control. I don't know. I mean, I'm being very honest. But as long as we hold on to this obsession and we don't let up, we are guilty of continuing to rationalize our own flaws. And we're not going to get out of it. I think acknowledgement of some of the flaws is probably the first step towards rehabilitation, isn't it? And maybe there is a need for rehabilitation.
Well, I wouldn't quite put it as an obsession with power and control. I think I would characterize it as a reflection of Singaporeans' general preference for a certain amount of order and stability. Again, this becomes very easy. Oh, it is because the government wants to control. Probably some element of truth in that. But government is in many ways reflecting the expressed views of a large number of the population. Many of these questions have come up, in policy discussions. Allowing people to use their kitchens, for instance, to sell food, right? In the spirit of entrepreneurship, and yes, if you can, you have some basic rules around it, why not? But the objections come from within the population. It's not that straightforward. Many Singaporeans do like the order and stability that we've grown up with and are comfortable with. And so when they see disorder or messiness, they're not too happy. So it is a process of trying to find that middle ground within quite a complex milieu of people who have slightly different various ways of looking at these things. I think one approach that's being taken is have enclaves then. Where there is freer expression, but not let it upset the wider population who like a certain amount of tranquility, if you will, and order and stability and everything else that goes with it. So, but again, this is not static because I think people's desires on these things also change.
Yeah.
Right?
And it's certainly evolving very, very fast. And, maybe we need a lot more icebreakers in our society, I mean, if you take the train, my God, the number of sad faces, the number of people who don't smile, really. I mean, do you realize that? I mean, people just don't smile. People just don't look happy. And it affects you, I mean, the times when I take the train, I just see, I come out feeling depressed, And if I don't feel depressed, I feel guilty, So I don't know. Part of it could be, I know it's easier said than done, but really chill a little bit more and laugh at ourselves. I don't know. I mean, does everything need to go through censorship process? Why don't we have a little bit more of digs at each other? I know that this is not going to happen overnight, but I feel that I'm giving you examples, but some of these things, if we do not allow it to happen, that denominator you're talking about is going to be affected. People need those outlets. Some things can't be changed, but some things can. And we need to decide what are those things that we can allow to change. Quick comment, and then I'll ask for the final question or comment, and then we wrap.
No, I'll just say that on these matters, the government takes its cue from what it senses as what most people desire.
But how do they censor, by the way?
Oh, you get lots of feedback. You get lots of feedback on. I mean, look. Even when it comes to things like having a retirement home, a childcare center, or a foreign worker dormitory, things that create some messiness, you get a lot of feedback. People like tranquility, order, the noise, things out of the ordinary trouble them. So you do have diverse, the society is not monolithic or homogeneous, it's very diverse. And in government, we really struggle with dealing with some of this. And this is one of the reasons behind the Singapore conversation. And, I keep saying it should not become a conversation between the government and the people. It's the most absurd thing to have. It should be a conversation among the people, so that people then see for one another, there are very different perspectives on these things. And we need to let more of that happen. And then society will find its balance. Of course, the government then needs to come in and always take the cue. It should not be too far behind. But if the government moves too far ahead, it can, can backfire in ways that you can't predict. But I agree, sensing that ground is very important. Fair enough, and occasionally gets it wrong. But it needs to just keep one half step behind where the central gravity of the population's views are on these things.
I think you've hit on a very important point. One step behind. But there's a tendency, I feel, sometimes for the government to be one step or two steps ahead. And that may be part of the problem. But again, I'm glad you're highlighting this, because that it's not about finding that solution. It's about throwing up ideas and perspectives. Final question, comment, please.
Hi, I'm Shane. Actually, I have one comment and two questions. Just taking my chance here.
Wow. Smart girl, okay. You must be from NUS.
I was from NUS, yes. My comment is that I think it takes two hands to clap. That not only is it got to do with what the government is doing for us, it takes the individual to also do something for ourselves. A lot of times it's about the societal expectations and the pressure on us that creates what we define as our own happiness. But a lot of times it's for us to step out of our own, that boundaries and expectations, to find the courage to explore for ourselves, to determine what our own happiness is. So that's just my take on it. My first question would be, with regards to diversity, we've talked about how it would be good to have different backgrounds in a let's say in a corporation or in a country. But the other question that is not answered, I think, is in terms of inclusion, because we can have diversity, but how do we actually get people to actually be more inclusive? Because you could have a diverse room of people, but then everybody breaks out into their own separate cliques. So how do we get that? Because I think once we can find the answer to that, it actually makes people more accepted and more happy. My second question is with regards to happiness and linking it to productivity. I think one of the questions these days is how to increase productivity. And there has been research that says that when an individual is happy, the productivity increases. And I can say this from my own personal experience as well, that in my company, when I'm happy, I feel that I would want to go the extra mile. And I am empowered to go the extra mile to do more things. So I think happiness is key in this sense. So instead of talking about, let's say, from the country level, in terms of measuring happiness, I'm interested to know your opinion on how you would measure happiness in an organization, in MES, for example. Thank you.
So in one round you went and asked that question. Okay, very good.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good. Let me start with that last bit there. I think what many companies do is, and including MAS we just recently did, is to do an employee engagement survey. We are not so ambitious as to try to measure happiness itself, but we have, and there are templates, and the Gallups of the world have these devices where they try to measure engagement levels. The Singapore workforce has not had fantastic engagement scores. That most are somewhere in the middle, and there's not too small a group that is actually disengaged.
Yeah.
I think you're quite right. That does have something to do with productivity, especially in a service-oriented economy where you're not creating midgets, you're widgets, right? In a service-oriented economy, that smile that you spoke about does matter in drawing a tighter link between how engaged you are with how productive you are. It has a lot to do with whether you take pride in the work, whether you believe in what you're doing, whether you believe that you're serving a purpose, a certain amount of professionalism. If these attributes are better developed, I think it makes for a more productive workforce. One of the interesting questions that we did and it's not ours, it was administered by an external agency, one of the questions they ask is, do you have a best friend? And I was very puzzled, and many of us were very puzzled. Why do you ask whether you have a best friend in your workplace? The question was, do you have a best friend in MAS? And although on several other things we didn't do great, on this we did not too badly. Not too badly. Whereas, and so we, it's not to be interpreted literally. A best friend is someone you trust, you confide in, you can seek help from, and you know will be there for you. And it's not literally as if you have a best friend at your workplace, but you have those kinds of people in your workplace. If you have that, it makes for a more productive and more engaged workforce. I think these softer aspects are really not being sufficiently emphasized. Yeah. We still have the manufacturing mindset, how many widgets in how many hours. But in the kind of economy we've evolved into, these attributes matter. Camaraderie, comradeship, fellowship, teamwork matter a great deal for productivity. You raised an important point, the first point you said about what we can do for ourselves. I believe in this very strongly, that there is too much expectation placed on what government can do. And no doubt there are some critical areas where they do need to pay more attention to. I mean, I don't have to mention transport, for instance, obviously, and they're on it. They're working hard at it. So there are a few areas where they need to. But on a much wider range of issues, people really ought to take more responsibility for themselves. We had a visitor from America about how communities self-organize when there are problems. There is no HDB to call to come and arbitrate. Neighbors get together in committees or bilaterally and knock together solutions. Whether the dry leaves from your house is coming into my house, it's something that people negotiate those boundaries, reach understandings, occasionally not very amicably, but that goes with the territory. But here the first instinct is to pick up the phone and call HDB. Come and fix this. The cat has run up the tree. Again, call the agency.
Call the police.
Call the police. I mean, it's very unfortunate. We need to get out of this and take more responsibility for, and that's why even on the issue of happiness, too important to be left to government. It's too important to be left to government. They can take care of the environment in which happiness can thrive, but we have to seek it ourselves in our own ways and not expect the government to step in to answer those needs.
Yeah. Thanks, Ravi. And if I can just add a rejoinder to your last comment, I completely agree with you that you can't leave it all to government. Maybe the best thing the government can do in some of these areas is to step aside. And it's something that we can think a little bit more about. And on that note, I'd like you to join me in saying a big thank you to Ravi. Big thank you. And I've known Ravi for too long, from school days, and I must say, he has not changed, and that's a compliment. He is, I'm proud to say, in my view, one of the most authentic individuals I've met. And I say this with a lot of pride. He is the same person on and off stage. And that's probably a big reason why he is also one of the happiest people I know, at least in government. Well, to make sure that he doesn't leave unhappy, we've got something for him. Thank you. We've got this picture that was taken of us earlier. One of us is better looking than the other. Actually, you don't look that bad, no?
Not much worse than you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now you've got to say something nice about us, in particular about me. Your autograph, please.
Okay.
That makes us happy. Something
That makes
us happy.
Oh, okay.
We had Tan Cho Chuan do this, and he confirmed that he's a doctor. Nobody could read it.
Good grief, I misspelled.
Did you go to NUS? Okay, could you read it for us?
Happy to be here and wish all of you much happiness. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, on that note, I'd like to thank you. And let's go out for some light refreshments. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much,
Thank you,
Ravi.
sir.
Thank you. Did you enjoy yourself?